The Kiros Report is honored to bring for the first time Professor Valentine Moghadam. I am sure I butchered the last brilliant Persian name, but she's so honest that she'll correct me if I need to be correct for the first time. She's a professor of sociology at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. Her career spans quite long, with numerous honors and awards, too long to list. But among many other things that she has done, she has worked as a research fellow on women and development at UNR or wider in Helsinki, Europe, that is, between 1990 and 1995, followed by a position that she occupied as Chief of Section Desk for UNESCO on Gender, Development and Women, 2002 to 2006. And she is currently a professor of sociology at Northeastern University. What a privilege to bring this professor to occupy our political imagination for the next hour as she dissects and deciphers the great Iran, previously a Persian empire. So I thought we should begin this particular historic episode with reflections on the great Persia, which is now Iran. And I would appreciate, as would my viewers, if we were to be given an opportunity to have a crash course with you, Professor, on Persia and now Iran. Take your time.
I will indeed, because it's a very long and ancient history, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you as well as to talk about the rich history of the country of my birth. All right, so 3,000 years in a nutshell. Ours is an ancient culture and history, as is yours, Theodoros, and it begins some 500 years before Christ. But we have encountered many other cultures throughout our history, whether due to expansion or war or conquest. It's a long and rich history, which is why Iran is also multi-ethnic and multilinguistic. So let me summarize, the 3,000 years of political history in a few bullet points, and then I can get into some details if you want. Let me begin with the ancient Persian empires, starting with the Achaemenids. We call them the Hachamaneshi, and the famous rulers Cyrus the Great and Darius, Dariush. The last of these pre-Islamic empires were the Sasanians, I think is how foreigners pronounce it. And the Persian empires coincided with the Greek, Roman, and Byzantine empires. The official religion was Zoroastrianism. Okay, that's one point. Then there was the Arab conquest of the late 7th century AD, and the process of Iran's Islamization under various dynasties, including several Turkic ones. So again, that goes back to what I was saying about we are multi-ethnic and multilinguistic. Then in the medieval era, there was a Persianization movement in art, language, and poetry, which is encapsulated in our great poet Ferdowsi's famous line, "Basi ranj bordam dar in sadisi, ajam zende kardam bedin parsi," which means how I have struggled and suffered over the past 30 years to keep the Persian language alive. So you see, Tedros, other countries in the region which experienced, Islam and the Arab invasions took Arabic as their language, but we never did. After that Persianization movement of the medieval era, we have the Mongol invasion, which was very brutal in the 13th century. But once the Mongol rulers became more civil, They enabled and promoted a period of artistic and literary flourishing, and quite a number of our famous poets came about during that time. Then I want to jump ahead to the early modern era with the Safavid dynasty of the 16th, 17th centuries, which coincided with two other Muslim majority empires, the Mughal dynasty of India and, of course, the Ottoman Empire of what is today, Turkey. And the Safavids are best known for having made Shia Islam the official religion of Islam, because, of course, after the Arab invasion, most Iranians were Sunni, but it was under the Safavids that Shiism became the official and dominant religion. And now jump forward to the early 20th century, our earlier, more recent modern period, with a push for a constitutionalist order, mashrute, and a parliament, majlis, which, by the way, coincided with similar reform movements in Russia in 1905, under the Ottomans, the Young Turks, and then a bit later, the Mexican Revolution of 1910, 1917. That was followed by modernization under the two Pahlavi kings, which was the last monarchy that we had, Reza Shah, around 1921 to 1941, and then his son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who ruled until the Iranian Revolution of 1979 with the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So just to quickly summarize now the more modern period in Iran, we have had three revolutions. Perhaps a little bit misnamed revolutions. The Constitutional Revolution of 1905. We had the so-called White Revolution of the Shah and the People, 1963. That was actually a series of reforms under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last monarch. And then we had the Iranian Revolution and the establishment of the Islamic Republic, which was a genuinely transformative social revolution. So in addition, Iran has experienced many cycles of protest over the past 150 years. And of course, the most recent was probably the most famous one, the Mahsa Jina protests of Zan Zendegi Azadi, woman life freedom that took place a couple of years back. And Iran also has had vexed relations with external powers, such as back in the day, Imperial Russia, Imperial Britain, and imperialist USA. But Iran has endured and has retained a very strong national identity. Yeah. So that's in a nutshell. I mean, if you like, I can go back to the ancient era and talk a little bit about the Hachamaneshi until the Sasanian, and then a little bit also about our rich cultural history, cultural heritage. Would you like me to do that?
Yes, please. Particularly Isfahan, one of the major Iranian cities. The beautiful Isfahan. Yes.
Isfahan is the Jahan. Yeah, right. If you want me to say a little bit more about, the ancient empire,
please.
I can certainly do that. And that, of course, begins with Cyrus the Great, Kurosh, who defeated the nearby kingdoms. Most famously, he defeated Babylonia. And then that begins the first formal dynasty known as I said, Achaemenid in English, or Hachamaneshi, as we call it. That empire was huge, Theodorus. I mean, it encompassed much of what is known as the Middle East and South Asia, including Mesopotamia, Egypt's Nile Valley, and India's Indus Valley. Many Babylonian Jews, by the way, were welcomed in Iran under Cyrus's reign, So Iran has had a Jewish community for over 3,000 years.
I see.
Yeah. Another great Persian king, Darius,
Darius.
ruled over the empire when it was at its largest, stretching from the Caucasus and West Asia to what is today's Balkans, the Black Sea, and Central Asia. You see, I mean, this is why Persian is spoken, in Afghanistan, in Tajikistan. The script is Persian in Pakistan and so on. So at the time of the Hachomanashi, the Achaemenids, the lingua franca, or the central language, was Aramaic. That changed later on, but at the time also the official religion was Zoroastrianism, which was a monotheistic religion. Even so, under those kings, Cyrus and Darius, Kurosh, Dariush, there was considerable tolerance for other religions and ways of life, at least until the waning years of that last empire, the Sasanian Empire. I'll say more about them later on. So still under the Hachomanashi, in addition to Zoroastrian, Jews and Christians were integrated into the empire and have a very long history of a presence in what is today's Iran. My family, for example, is Christian. So Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians were actually in Iran before the Muslims, but we have all integrated, and the official language is Persian, even though we have other languages that people speak in the different governorates and provinces. So the Persian Empire entered a period of decline after a failed invasion of Greece by Xerxes I, Khashoggi, as we call him, in 480 BC. Today the Greeks and the Persians, we love each other. But back in the day, we fought a lot of battles. The costly defense of Persians' lands depleted the empire's funds, and the Hachomanashi dynasty finally fell to the invading armies of Alexander the Great. We call him Alexander of Macedonia, Iskandar Macedonian, which happened in 330 BC. And then subsequent rulers sought to restore the Persian Empire to its glory of the Achaemenid boundary and to its expanse and boundaries. But the empire never really regained the enormous size that it had under Cyrus and under Darius. So I mentioned the Sasanian, that last empire before Islam. That empire was founded by Ardashir the First, who sought to restore the legacy of the Achaemenids through expansion. At its height, the Sasanian Empire was also pretty large, and it controlled not only what is modern-day Iran and modern-day Iraq, but also parts of the Arabian Peninsula and the Caucasus, the Levant, and parts of Central Asia and South Asia. Now, by that time, the lingua franca had shifted from Aramaic to what the scholars call Middle Persian. Don't ask me about that because, I'm not a scholar of linguistics, but my late father, could say some words in that ancient, Persian language. The Sasanians sought to develop a centralized regime, and its religious hierarchy became less tolerant than it had been, and it became more intolerant of some of the non-Zoroastrian minorities, especially the Christians. And so the Sasanian elite became less popular. So that waning popularity, in addition to some of the internecine conflicts that were taking place with allies and the withdrawal of support on the part of certain allies, made the Sasanian Empire and its last kings more vulnerable to the invading Arab tribes. So throughout this era, as I mentioned earlier, the Persian empires from the Hachomenishi to the Sasanian coincided with Greek, Roman, and Byzantine empires, and fought a lot of battles with them as well. But that's our rich history. And by the way, a lot of this history is told in our national epic poem, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, written by the great Ferdowsi. And if you like, I can talk a little bit about the cultural heritage of of Iran, both art, literature, poetry, and maybe some archaeology too. And I will not forget the carpets and the beautiful architecture of Isfahan.
Please do. Please do. Yes, this is an occasion to
Yeah,
historic Iran. Yes.
so our cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, is remarkably rich. I mean, I say this as a very proud Iranian, of course. And of course, many other cultures are also eminently rich, your own, Teodros. But, some of our earliest Persian art includes these large carved rock reliefs that are cut into cliffs, such as those found in Naxos, which is near Persepolis, the ancient um, uh, sort of capital, as it were, of the ancient empires. And it includes a cemetery filled with the tombs of the ancient kings. Um, they're very elaborate rock murals, which almost every Iranian will go and pay homage to. And they depict, for example, equestrian scenes and battle victories too. And then, of course, there's Persepolis itself. Every Iranian pays a visit to Persepolis. We also call it Takht Jamshid, and it's near Shiraz in southwest Iran, and it's our equivalent of the Acropolis. Persepolis is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So, when many people think of Iran, they think of Persian carpets.
Yes.
We have carpets from all over Iran, your
Yeah.
favorite city, and also mine, Isfahan. but
Yes.
also, but also very famous carpets are from Kerman, and they're probably the most, and also Qom. And we have beautiful carpets from throughout the country, actually. Although perhaps Isfahan and Kerman are the most famous. I have several here, by the way. So but Persian carpets go back to ancient times, and it is said that the ancient Greeks prized the artistry of those hand woven rugs when they encountered them during, the many battles that were fought. But in addition to the carpets, Teodros, we also have famous metalwork. And that was very, very advanced in both ancient Persia and afterwards. And you can see these marvelous metal, bronze, silver trays and bowls and pitchers, flasks with their engravings. They're very fine engravings at any number of the world's museums, including here in Boston's Museum of Fine Arts.
Yes.
There's a small exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts, larger ones, at other museums. And I mean, I go there once a week and I just stare into them. They're really quite beautiful. And then there are our beautiful miniature, as we call them. A lot of our, by the way, a lot of our non-Persian words are French, like miniature. So these are figures and inscriptions painted on ivory, often depicting scenes from the Shahnameh, the book of Kings, as I said, Iran's national epic, and they tend to be placed in gorgeous in a gorgeous frame. They're very typical, very distinctive as Iranian art, and I have them all over my flat on walls and tables. Unfortunately, not behind me. I should have brought one. Those are actually what you can see behind me are the framed what are they, certificates of my grandfather certificate as a medical doctor and my father's university when he graduated from the University of Tehran Engineering College. Okay, so, but I should have had one of those famous miniature here.
Next time. Next time.
Um, so, yeah, so, you know, that the Muslim conquest, the Arab conquest of the late 7th century AD, marked a dramatic shift, Islamization. However, Iran's pre-Islamic history and culture remained a key part of Iranian national identity throughout the ages, Theodore. In art, in poetry, again, everybody reads the Shahnameh. And everybody has these carpets, everyone has these miniatures, everyone knows the names of the ancient kings. And you know, a lot of Iranian families will also name their children after the ancient kings and queens. Of course, many Iranians are pious Muslims, and they name their children, after Muhammad, Ali, Hassan, Hussein, many of the Islamic names. But also, many families will give their children pre-Islamic names. So that pre-Islamic heritage of ours remains and can be seen in art, in poetry, in people's names, and in certain holidays and celebrations, especially Eid al-Nowruz, which is our New Year's, which falls on the first day of spring. Also, I should say that the months of the year also reflect the pre-Islamic history and culture. Etc. Those are pre-Islamic words and names. So, you know, you can see that, a great deal of our ancient history and culture has remained a part of our own daily practices and our national identity. I mentioned the Shahnameh, and this was part of that Persianization period that I mentioned earlier too, which occurred in the 11th century. And that occurred during those Turkic dynasties, in fact. But that was a period when Persian was revived and has remained, our principal language. And it became the language of our other famous poets. So obviously, Ferdowsi, but also Rudaki, who lived around the same time or a little bit before him, I believe. But also our famous Omar Khayyam, Rumi, Sa'di, Hafez, and these are our poets, and there are others too that span the 11th to the 15th centuries AD. We still read them. I mean, I still have my father's books of poetry. I mean, he was an engineer, and yet he was constantly reading Persian poetry to himself and out loud to us. And he had all these, small books of poetry, and I still have them. I've retained them. So there you go. What should I say? After, I mentioned the Mongol invasion and conquest of the 13th century and into the 14th. It was quite brutal. I mean, they destroyed a lot of they also destroyed Baghdad. It was very bloody and very brutal. I mean, what would you expect of Genghis Khan? But the invading hordes eventually integrated themselves into Iranian society. They embraced Islam and the Persian language, and they actually promoted art. So, some of these poets that I mentioned, they were during that period. So that, I suppose we have them to thank for the retention of the Persian language.
Okay.
I just
Well,
want to say something about the religion to others
yes.
because it explains something about the restive nature of some of our provinces in Iran. I said earlier that the Safavids made Shia Islam the official religion. Um, so most Iranian Muslims are Shia, um, but there remain Sunni Muslims in Iran, in Kurdistan, in Sistan, Baluchistan, in the east, and in Khuzestan, in the south. And they constitute a minority religious community, and they do consider themselves to be somewhat oppressed and discriminated against. Um, and
Mm.
I sometimes find it, interesting and ironic that they feel more oppressed than, for example, I don't know, Iranian Christians or Zoroastrians. So there you go. Um, and these are also, I should say, these are also provinces that the regimes, especially the modern regimes, have not exactly put a great deal of resources and revenues into, and so they remain somewhat underdeveloped, especially Sistan Baluchistan. Yeah. So I should say that they are actually they do have legitimate grievances. So shall I go into some modern
No, that's
theories
all right. No,
with
that's
the Pahlavis?
uh,
Um, yeah. So once I'm going over quite a number of. So we had
things.
that constitutional revolution, of course, in the early part of the 1900s, and there was um, some aspirations for an Iranian republic, a republican sort of political system. And we were rather close to, establishing that because remember the early 1900s, this was the legacy of the revolutions of the 1800s, also the revolutions of France and the United States. And, there was some hope that the constitutional revolution would lead to a republic. Well, Reza Khan came and, overthrew the last dynasty, the Qajars, the last pre-Pahlavi dynasty, the Qajars. And again, in 1921, there was some expectation that a republic would emerge. However, in 1925, he crowned himself Shah. So, and that was to the disappointment of the Republicans. On the positive side, his reign was characterized by tremendous modernization and institution building, including the establishment of the University of Tehran, which is where my father took his engineering degrees. He was part of the second cohort. And, his professors, my late father's professors, had been educated in Europe and France, etc. Um, there was some road construction, bridge building, and so on. But the establishment of Tehran University, and then the government infrastructure too. A lot of the ministries, the buildings were established at that time under Reza Shah and so on. So he is considered actually, a national hero by many Iranians, not all, but many, especially of my late father's generation. But his later years. So he was king from 1925 to 1941. And those later years coincided with the growing contention among European powers. And when he chose not to ally himself and Iran with the Allied powers against Germany, he was forced to abdicate in 1941 in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza. Okay, so we have World War II, and of course the Europeans are busy, fighting each other, etc. So some of the countries of the world in the global south are left to their own devices, Latin America and Iran too. And that period between 1941 and 1953 was remarkable for the growing role of new institutions, a much stronger constitutional era, a stronger parliament, the Majlis, and political parties, including Iran's Communist Party, the Tudeh Party. And all of this generated, for the first time, a more pluralistic political environment. And by the way, for the last time, a more pluralistic political environment. Now, this ended in 53, but before that, in 1951, the government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh of the National Front Party, it was a front actually of several parties, nationalized the oil industry, which had been previously controlled by Britain. The US joined Britain in sanctioning Iran and refusing to purchase its now nationalized oil. Let me just say something about that and how unfortunate we were. Because what was happening in 1950, 51, 52, 53? It was the Cold War. It was the American and British obsession, especially the American obsession with communism. And also, of course, their obsession over oil. However, back in 1938, Mexico nationalized its oil industry without any problem. It was able to do so because there was this global political opportunity structure of all the Europeans and the US being preoccupied with the coming of World War II. And so the Mexicans were lucky enough not only to be able to nationalize their oil without being sanctioned, but to then sell oil to the United States for the war effort. We were totally unfortunate in that respect because our nationalization coincided with the Cold War and the obsession both with anti-communism and with Britain expecting all of that oil for its reconstruction. Anyway, long story short, the 1953 coup d'etat was orchestrated by the CIA under Eisenhower and MI6 under Winston Churchill. It was a national calamity, and it is seared in our collective memory. And we will never forgive the guilty parties. We'll never forget them. Anyway, what happened was more modernization under the Shah, under Mohammed. Now, my late father was a product of the modernization period of Reza Pahlavi. I am a product of the modernization of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. But those were under conditions of monarchical autocracy. And the Shah once, rather arrogantly said to a European interviewer, "When my people become democratic, I will rule democratically," or words to that effect. In any event, his rule became increasingly unpopular, especially in the face of a growing educated population, also people still with grievances about what had happened earlier in 1953 and so on. But there was also a sizable population of very pious Muslims who fell under the spell of the then exiled Ayatollah Khomeini and his partners. After a year of massive protests, the Shah left Iran in January 1979, and Khomeini returned in February. And what followed was a very brief democratic period with a coalition government. But that fell apart very quickly, especially after the first wave of executions, which took place in August of that year. So chaos and repression and hardships ensued with, hijab, the head covering for women and complete covering, that became compulsory. The taking of hostages from the US Embassy, Iraq's invasion of Iran in 1980, and the start of a dreadful 10-year war, numerous arrests in the early 1980s, and then that terrible summer of 1988 when some 3,000 political prisoners were secretly executed. And many communists and other leftists, lost their lives, and others went underground or they fled. And I went to Kabul, Afghanistan, on a research trip in early 1989, and I met some of those Iranian communists who had fled, and they had been given refuge by the comrades in who were then, in power in Afghanistan, which was really very solidaristic, of them. But that ended in 1994. That's a different story. So, mercifully, Khomeini died soon after the killings and the end of the war with Iraq. And then there was a period of relaxation in the 1990s under President Rafsanjani, as well as some, political economic reconstruction.
Yeah.
So what ensued, at that time in the 1990s, Iranians who were in exile were beginning to travel back to Iran. He allowed that to happen. And I went back, for a visit. This was also a flourishing of films and literature and the press, an incipient civil society, Teodoro, started to emerge. And it grew, especially under the reformist president, Mohammad Khatami, who had two terms, 1997 to 2005. And then women began, to thrive with a feminist press and cinema, literary works, and so on and so forth. And they were also able to benefit from educational attainment, from a very effective family planning program, which then really affected the population size, and fertility, went down. So there was a lot of also synergies between activists in civil society and activists and progressives in the parliament. So, that was an era where there were possibilities for a rapprochement with the US. But the Bush government slammed the door on that. After 9/11, okay, 2001. So what was 9/11 about? 19 terrorists from Arab countries, 15 of them from Saudi Arabia, not a single Iranian. They, attacked buildings in the United States and so on. In Iran, everybody was so sympathetic. The government of Khatami was very sympathetic. President Khatami actually offered to help locate those Al Qaeda terrorists who were next door in Afghanistan. Now, what does Bush do? How does he respond? He calls Iran part of the axis of evil. That also includes Iraq and North Korea, for good measure. This slap in the face, Teodros, strengthened the position of the hardliners in Iran's state. So that was the end of the reformist period, the flourishing of civil society, etc. So in the 2005 presidential and parliamentary elections, the hardliners won, and they clamped down on civil society. And there was one of the biggest protests since 1979 took place in 2009, the Green Protest. Many Iranians were very upset with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's clamping down of civil society, and they felt that his second election was rigged. So he enriches uranium, and then, of course, the U.S. starts with the sanctions. Yeah, and the Obama administration, the Obama government, actually really instituted very harsh sanctions.
Excellent. Now, what I would like to do is we have about 15 minutes left.
Oh.
And I would like to devote, it was remarkable. First of all, let me congratulate you for being an extraordinary teacher and how lucky Northeastern University is to have a professor of your caliber, a precise visionary. Now, your career path marked remarks a particular interest that you have in the plight of women. I notice that both as a research officer, but also the chief of desk chief at the UNESCO, your career highlights the interconnections between gender development and women's plights. Why so?
Well, in part because I'm a woman, in part because I encountered feminist scholarship back in the 1980s. And, at the time, of course, my disciplinary approach in sociology and the theoretical tools that I would deploy were, Marxist and world systems analysis, etc. But when I encountered feminism, I realized that there was a gender component to much of what had gone on in history and in political history, and also what was going on around the world, and especially in Iran. Because one of the first laws that the Islamic Republic laid down had to do with gender relations and the status of women. To make hijab compulsory, to say that there was something wrong with women's bodies and you had to cover your hair and your body fully, as if it's not sufficient that we are dressed, quite modestly like this. That was quite an affront, but there was something to be said for the gendered nature of the Islamization project in Iran. So in addition to the class dimension and also the world systemic dimension of the revolution and the process of Islamization, there was a very strong gender dimension to it as well. So I've been, focused on that, on the plight of women, on the status of women for quite some time. A lot of that work includes a lot of just empirical work on patterns of female labor force participation and how women are situated in the labor force, where, by the way, there's extraordinarily low female labor force participation, despite, for example, increasing educational attainment, declining fertility rates, and so on. So there are problems on both the supply and the demand side of the equation. And this is an issue that I've spent a great deal of time writing about by myself, and also with the economist who happens to be my husband, Professor Masoud Koshinas. And we just published something recently in the journal Sociology of Development. So there's the economic participation side of things that I have focused on, and why it is that Iranian women are such a small proportion of the total labor force. And the other side of it is the political side, and why it is that women are also such a tiny proportion of the political process, of the parliament, of the majlis. Yes. It is, to be honest, it's disgraceful and scandalous. Over the years of the Islamic Republic, women have never constituted more than 5% of the members of parliament, of the members of the majlis. I mean, the UN has established a minimum of 30% female political representation. Your country has, an even higher proportion. And we have just been stuck at 5%. Again, there seem to be problems on both the supply and the demand side. The political elites in Iran are men, and also it's highly masculinist. So it's not very welcoming of women. I personally know some of the former female members of parliament. They really struggled a lot in parliament when they were MPs. And although they did manage uh, establish a couple of legislative reforms, um, they kept butting their heads against these masculinist colleagues who simply did not entertain any changes in the legal status of women, for example. So they had wanted Iran to sign CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That never happened. So Iran has the dubious distinction of being in the same category of the U.S., which also has not signed on to CEDAW. So, these are some of the, now, unlike their representation in the labor force and their representation in formal politics, Iranian women have been very active in civil society and in those protest cycles that I mentioned earlier. They were actually among the very first protesters against the Islamic Republic on International Women's Day, March 8th, 1979. The first protest against the Islamic Republic was by women. There were also protests in 2005 and again in 2009, those green protests, enormous women's presence and participation. I mean, you can go online, Google those green protests, and you will see just waves of women. And again, in 2022, the fall of 2022, with the Woman Life Freedom protest. I mean, that was women-led. So Iranian women are very much involved with civil society and especially with the protest cycles. They're making a lot of demands on the political elites, less so on the economic elites, which I feel is a little bit of a deficit. I mean, I think there should be more of a critique of the economic system in Iran, which is capitalist. But that's not the case. They do tend to translate my work into Persian. So they're familiar with with my writings, and I'm always delighted to know that my articles have been translated. So a lot of people know me in Iran, and I get emails and so on, and I'm just honored to do so. I mean, it's really very rewarding when you think that your work is actually having some kind of good reception. But I have to say that some people are not very receptive to my work because I've also been extremely critical of the U.S. sanctions and U.S. foreign policy. And there are people who feel that my position aligns with that of the Islamic Republic. And, for that reason, they might be, critical of the amount of time I spend criticizing the sanctions and criticizing U.S. foreign policy. Of course, so many of my writings since the 1980s have also criticized the repressive nature of the Islamic Republic and of its gender regime. But I also expend a great deal of my research showing the gendered impacts, the adverse gendered impacts of those sanctions, and which quite a number of Iranian scholars and feminists recognize in Iran, but a lot of people think that that's less important than, for example, just constantly attacking the Islamic regime. So my work does get translated, and I'm always honored to know that, and it's always a pleasure to support Iranian scholars, which I try to do. I mean, I have published papers with two Iranian Kurdish sociologists. I published one in Third World Quarterly with a young woman and with her professor, and I have another one that will soon be published in the journal International Sociology. It's co-written with the same Kurdish Iranian sociologist, Professor Qadir Sadeh, who's at the University of Sanandaj. And there are young people, young scholars in Iran that I have tried to support by encouraging them to come to my university and that sort of thing.
Of course, this is not surprising because after all, you have published 5 books on Iran, you have edited 9, you have co-authored another book, you have written hundreds of articles, you continue to exemplify your concern and interest with women as human beings within the context of Iran's role in international global economy, which I was going to devote a question to. But now that we are running out of time, and I know how busy you are, but I intend to bring you back a few months from now. And I would like us to do an episode on Iran's role in global political economy. This has been your host, Theodoros Kiros, for the Kiros Report, with a great professor of sociology at Northeastern University. Thank you for visiting with us.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Goodbye to everyone.